For a broken-down truck and a bottle of whiskey, the father sold his deaf daughter. He didn't care who bought her. But he never expected the buyer to be him. The town of Oasis cooked under the Arizona sun, a blister of dust and desperation on the edge of nowhere. Its flea market was less a place of commerce and more a graveyard of broken dreams, where men with whiskey-sour breath traded rust for pocket change. It was here that John Cain moved through the midday heat, a ghost in a dust-colored world. He was a large man, built from silence and hard-won stillness, his long dark hair tied back and a thick beard hiding whatever expressions he might have once owned. He was there for engine parts, nothing more. Then he saw the girl. Her name, he would later learn, was Elara. She was maybe 19, standing in the shadow of a beat-up Ford pickup, a dirty rope tied loosely around her wrist. Her dress was frayed, her face smudged with grime, but her eyes were the oldest things in Oasis. They were still, empty pools that seemed to absorb the world without judgment. Her father, a wreck of a man named Jed, reeked of cheap liquor and despair. He'd sold everything he could, tools, tires, a rusty generator, and still didn't have enough. In a final, wretched act, he shoved Elara forward into the small, curious circle of onlookers. $100. Jed's voice was a ragged saw. She's deaf. Mute, too. Won't give you no lip. Cooks, cleans, she's strong. He yanked the rope to prove a point, and she stumbled but didn't fall. Someone, just take her. $100. It wasn't a sale, it was an exorcism. A pathetic attempt to cast out the last reminder of his own failure. A few men chuckled darkly. Another spat on the ground. Most just looked away, their indifference a cruelty all its own. No one moved. No one spoke. Cain had already turned to leave. This was not his fight. He had a fortress of solitude miles out in the desert, built specifically to keep this kind of ugly world out. But then, across the sea of apathy, her eyes found his. It wasn't a plea. There was no fear, no hope for rescue. It was something deeper. A look of quiet, profound recognition, as if one ghost was finally seeing another. She saw the fortress he had built around his soul, and she didn't even knock. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the silent command in that gaze. You see me. Cain stopped. He turned back slowly, his presence a sudden weight in the shimmering heat. He walked through the small crowd, which parted without thinking. He stood before Jed, towering over him. He didn't speak. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn money clip, and peeled off two $50 bills. He didn't hand them to Jed, he pressed them into the man's grubby shirt pocket. Then, Cain's attention turned to the rope. His large, steady hands moved to Elara's wrist. He untied the knot with a deliberate, final motion and let the rope fall into the dust. He looked at Elara and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Come. She did. Without hesitation, she fell into step behind him as he walked away, leaving her father to count his silver, and the town of Oasis to whisper about the day the quiet man from the desert bought himself a soul. The drive to Cain's property was silent. He drove the old Jeep, not the broken-down truck he'd technically paid for. Elara sat in the passenger seat, small and still, her eyes on the endless horizon of rock and sand. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget. She just watched the world go by as if she were already a part of it. His home wasn't a house, it was a compound. A long, high fence of corrugated metal surrounded a sprawling workshop, a Spartan living quarters, and a yard of packed earth. It was a place designed for privacy and defense, built by a man who wanted to be left alone. He led her inside the living area. It was clean, orderly, and impersonal. He pointed to a small, neat room with a single bed. Yours, he said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He then walked to a wall and pointed to a small whiteboard and a set of dry erase markers. He uncapped a black marker, handed it to her, and tapped the board. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, then took the marker. Her handwriting was surprisingly neat, a single word appearing in soft, slanted letters, Elara. He read it and nodded once. That was the extent of their conversation. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Elara moved through the compound with a quiet efficiency. She cleaned the workshop, organized tools, and tended to the small, stubborn vegetable garden he kept out back. She never made a sound, but the space began to feel less empty. It began to feel like a home. The first sign came a week later. Cain was working on a massive diesel generator, the heart of his off-grid existence. He was deep in its guts, covered in grease, fine-tuning the engine. The air was thick with the smell of fuel. Suddenly, she was there, a blur of motion at his side. She didn't make a sound, but her urgency was a physical force. She grabbed the sleeve of his shirt, her small hand of ice, and pulled. Her eyes were wide, her face a mask of terror, screaming a warning her lips could not form. She pointed frantically at the machine. Cain, trained to react on instinct, didn't question it. He trusted the fear. He trusted her. He threw himself backward, away from the generator, landing hard on the concrete floor. He wasn't a second too soon. A high-pitched whine erupted from the machine, a sound of metal tearing itself apart. With a deafening bang that shook the entire workshop, the generator's housing blew outward in a shower of sparks and black smoke. A piece of shrapnel the size of a fist embedded itself in the wall right where Cain's head had been moments before. The workshop fell silent again, save for the crackle of burning wires. Cain lay on the floor, his ears ringing, staring at the smoking ruin. He looked over at Elara, who was huddled by the door, her chest heaving with silent, ragged breaths. There was no way she could have heard the mechanical failure building deep inside that engine. No one could have. She hadn't heard. She had felt it. She had sensed the coming violence, the chaos waiting to be born. And for the first time, John Cain looked at the deaf girl he had rescued and felt a tremor of something he hadn't experienced in years, absolute, unexplainable awe. In the quiet aftermath of the generator incident, Cain began to watch Elara differently. He saw her as more than a rescued victim, she was a mystery, a force he couldn't categorize. Her strange hearing manifested in small, undeniable ways. She'd water a pot of herbs just minutes before it began to wilt. She'd approach his rescued dog, a snarling beast that trusted no one, and calm it with a single, slow touch to its head, as if she could hear the fear beneath its growls. Her most profound perception, however, was aimed at him. Cain was a man haunted by a past he never spoke of. Some nights, the ghosts of old missions would visit him in his sleep, and he'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. One such night, after a particularly violent nightmare, he sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, drowning in the silent screams of his memory. A few moments later, the door creaked open. Elara stood there, holding a glass of cold water. She didn't speak, didn't look at him with pity. She simply placed the glass on his bedside table and retreated, closing the door softly behind her. She had heard his suffering, a sound no one else could, and had answered it with a simple act of quiet care. A bond formed between them in that shared silence, a language of gestures and intuition. He was her protector, she was his anchor. But the world outside the compound walls was not silent. On their rare trips into Oasis for supplies, the town watched them. Whispers followed them like shadows. Elara's stillness, her unblinking gaze that seemed to see too much, made people uneasy. It started with small things. A woman at the general store pulled her child away when Elara walked past. One afternoon, Elara paused and stared intently at the front tire of a parked truck. Minutes later, the tire blew out with a loud hiss. The truck's owner looked from the flat tire to Elara's retreating back, and a seed of fear was planted. The old-world superstitions of witchcraft had been replaced by modern anxieties. She wasn't a witch, she was creepy. Unnatural. An unlucky omen. Her silence was a vacuum, and the townspeople rushed to fill it with their own fears. They couldn't understand her, so they decided to fear her. Cain saw the change in their eyes, the way they'd cross the street to avoid them. He saw the way Elara's shoulders would tense, the way her hands would grip her small basket a little tighter. The fortress he had built could keep out men, but it couldn't stop the poison of fear from seeping through the cracks. The town's fear needed a leader, and it found one in Harlan, a loud-mouthed local whose influence came from being the meanest man in any room. Harlan ran a small, grimy bar with a few illegal gambling machines in the back. One of his machines had shorted out and died the day after Elara had glanced at it while walking past. For Harlan, that was proof enough. He gathered a small, angry mob of 4 other men, fueled by cheap beer and simmering resentment, and drove out to Cain's compound at dusk. They stood outside the metal gate, a pathetic collection of bravado and ignorance. "Cain!" Harlan's voice echoed in the quiet desert. "We know you're in there. Send out the weird girl. She's brought a curse on this town." The heavy workshop door slid open, and Cain emerged. He didn't run, didn't shout. He walked to the gate with a slow, deliberate pace, his presence sucking the air out of their righteous anger. He stood on his side of the fence, arms relaxed at his sides, and just looked at them. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. "She put the jinx on my machine." Harlan blustered, less confident now. Stared at it, and it fried itself. "She ain't right." Another man chimed in, "My dog's been sick ever since she looked at it. We want her gone." Cain let their accusations hang in the air, letting the silence magnify their foolishness. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, a sound that carried immense weight. "She did nothing to your machine," he said, his eyes locked on Harlan. "It was a piece of junk. Just like your courage." Harlan flinched as if struck. "And your dog," Cain continued, his gaze shifting to the other man, "is sick because you feed it garbage and leave it chained in the sun." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You're afraid of her because she's quiet. You're afraid because she sees things you can't. You think that's a curse." He took a step closer to the gate, and the men instinctively took a step back. "She's not cursing you," Cain said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something that felt ancient and true. "She's listening. She listens to the broken parts of the world. The pain in an old dog. The sickness in a machine. She listens to the fear in your hollow hearts. That's her power. And it terrifies you, because you've forgotten how to listen to anything at all." He stood there, an immovable object. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threat, but the confrontation was over. Harlan muttered something under his breath, but the fight had gone out of him. Defeated by a handful of words and an ocean of silence, the mob dispersed, their headlights cutting pathetic swaths through the encroaching darkness as they retreated back to town. The dust storm came without mercy, a monstrous, rolling wall of brown that turned the midday sun to a dim orange smudge. It swallowed Oasis in minutes, the wind howling like a banshee, visibility dropping to near zero. In the chaos, panic erupted. The town sheriff's 8-year-old son, who had been playing near the edge of town, was missing. A search party was formed, but it was a futile effort. Men shouted into the wind, their voices stolen by the gale. They couldn't see 5 feet in front of them. The child was lost to the storm. Back at the compound, the wind hammered against the workshop walls. Cain secured the doors while Elara stood by the large window, staring out into the roaring chaos. But she wasn't looking at the storm. She was looking through it. Her eyes were unfocused, her body perfectly still. She was listening. Suddenly, she turned from the window. She ran to the whiteboard, her movements urgent and precise. Her hands flew, the marker a blur. It wasn't writing, it was a drawing. A map. A series of rough landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a dried-up riverbed, a cluster of dead trees, and then, a small X marking a spot deep in the Badlands, the entrance to the old, abandoned Black Creek mine. She turned the board to Cain, her eyes pleading with him to understand. She couldn't explain how she knew. There was no logic to it. It was a signal she had picked up from the terrified heart of a lost boy, a whisper carried on the raging wind that only she could hear. Cain looked at the hand-drawn map, then at her face. The entire town was searching blindly, but here was a map, drawn by a girl who had never set foot in those badlands. In that moment, he made a choice. He chose to trust her power over the world's logic. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed a GPS, a medical kit, and heavy-duty flashlights. He fired up his modified Jeep, its engine a roar against the storm. Using her drawing as his guide, he plunged into the blinding dust. It was a treacherous, near-impossible drive. He navigated by instinct, memory, and the unwavering belief in the map she had drawn. He found the mine entrance exactly where she had marked it. And inside, huddled behind a collapsed cart, was the sheriff's son, scared, cold, with a twisted ankle, but alive. When Cain returned to Oasis with the boy, the storm was beginning to break. The wind died down, and the dust began to settle. He walked into the sheriff's office, the child in his arms, and the town looked at him with stunned disbelief. "How?" the sheriff asked, his voice choked with emotion. "How did you find him?" Cain looked past the sheriff, toward the edge of town where his own compound lay. "I didn't," he said. "She did." In that moment, the fear the town held for Elara shattered, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. She wasn't a curse. She was a miracle. The rescue changed everything. The whispers about Elara didn't just stop, they transformed. Fear turned to reverence. The people of Oasis, who had once crossed the street to avoid her, now left offerings at the gate of the compound, a basket of fresh bread, a box of engine parts, a hand-knitted shawl. They didn't know how to speak to her, so they spoke through gifts. Life at the compound settled into a new, deeper quiet. Cain taught Elara how to maintain the solar panels, how to read a schematic. In return, she taught him a different kind of knowledge. When his past would rise up to choke him, she would simply sit with him, her silent presence a balm that soothed the ghosts. She was teaching him how to be still. Their bond was no longer just about protection, it was a partnership of two lonely souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. One evening, they sat on the workshop steps, watching the desert sky bleed into a tapestry of purple and orange. The air was cool and clean. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, Elara picked up the whiteboard she now carried with her everywhere. She wrote for a moment, then turned it to him. The letters were small and neat, a sentence that held the entire truth of their shared world. "I can't hear the world, but I can hear you." Cain read the words, and something inside his chest, a lock that had been rusted shut for decades, finally clicked open. The man who had faced down armies and stared into the abyss of human cruelty felt a warmth spread through him that was more powerful than the desert sun. A slow smile, unfamiliar and utterly real, touched John Cain's face. He didn't write a reply. He didn't need to. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers where it rested on the whiteboard. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything. "I hear you, too." In the vast silence of the desert, under a blanket of stars, two people who had been discarded by the world found a language all their own. It wasn't a language of sounds or words, but of presence, of trust, of souls that had finally, truly been heard. Does true communication require words? In your opinion, what is the deepest form of listening? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. And if you believe in stories that touch the soul, subscribe for more.